Three ridge lines, three states, and the exact same hour of the exact same morning. A tall figure wearing a long duster coat moved west along the high ground, not running, but just walking, yet he covered a distance that simply didn't add up. Witnesses in Virginia saw him, witnesses in Kentucky saw him, and witnesses in Tennessee saw him as well. When the local newspapers finally printed what those people reported, nobody noticed at first that the dates and times matched perfectly, making the geography of the whole thing impossible. The papers called him the Mountain Walker for a short time, but then they stopped writing about him entirely. To this day, nobody has ever explained why. There is a kind of silence that only those who have been to the mountains of Kentucky know. It isn't the tranquil silence of a Sunday afternoon, but another kind that feels dense, alive, and layered. The wind descending those slopes carries something with it that you can't easily explain in words. Back in the 1880s, before telephone lines reached the hollows, and before any road wide enough for a wagon connected the ridge communities to the valley towns, that silence was just the permanent condition of life. News moved the way everything else moved, which is to say it traveled slowly, by foot or by word of mouth. You might get a weekly paper that arrived folded and smeared with mud, assuming it arrived at all. A community of 200 or 300 people sitting in a hollow between ridges might go a full week without hearing a single thing from the county seat, and they might go 2 weeks without hearing from the next state over. For the people living there, the world outside the mountains was mostly just a theory. That isolation did something specific to the way people paid attention to their surroundings. When a stranger appeared on the ridge road, people noticed him, and they remembered what he wore, which direction he came from, and whether he nodded or looked away. There was no such thing as casual foot traffic in these communities, so every unfamiliar face became an event worth talking about, and the local paper was where those remarks ended up. Births, deaths, land transfers, and visiting relatives all went into the weekly column alongside unusual weather or a stranger seen on the high ground moving west. The editors wrote everything in the same flat, factual tone, because that was the entire purpose of the paper. This context matters because it shapes how you have to read the accounts that follow. These weren't communities with any real appetite for sensational stories or tall tales. You wouldn't find dime novels being written in the hollows, and there was no penny press running lurid headlines for a city audience hungry for cheap thrills. The readers of a small Virginia agricultural weekly were farmers and mill workers who wanted information rather than entertainment, and any editor who started printing legends would have lost his readership fast. These were practical people reading a practical publication, so when something unusual appeared in print, it was because someone with a name and a real address reported it as a fact. Photography barely existed in this world in any way that mattered to the average person. A working family in a mountain community in 1883 might go their entire lives without ever seeing a photograph of themselves. There were no cameras on the ridge roads and no telegraph wires running into the hollows, which meant there was no way to verify a report quickly or argue against it from a distance. All you had was the word of your neighbors, which was then said in type by a man you probably knew personally. When those newspapers started describing the same figure, the same coat, and that same refusal to stop, you have to understand the world those descriptions came from. It wasn't a world prone to making things up. A stranger on the ridgeline was genuinely strange to them, and the people who saw him had every reason to report exactly what they saw. The earliest account that researchers have managed to track down comes from a small Virginia county paper, likely printed somewhere in the early 1880s. While the exact issue hasn't survived in any archive, 1883 or 1884 is the best estimate we have for when this story first broke. What we have left are references to the article, citations in old letters, and a partial reprint in a neighboring county's gazette that ran the story without much of a fuss. The description from that first account is specific enough that you really have to sit with it for a moment. He was tall and broad across the shoulders, wearing a long duster coat of the kind that working men in the mountains used for travel. It was heavy canvas, knee-length, and cut specifically to shed rain off a man's back during a long trek. He was moving west along the high ridgeline above the valley, rather than taking the road below, and the pace he kept was what caught people's attention first. He wasn't running or rushing in any way that looked like urgency, but he was walking steadily with a stride that covered ground at a rate that didn't seem to match what a normal walk produces. One witness described it as watching a man walk the way water moves downhill, unhurried but continuous, as if the terrain couldn't stop him even if it tried. Multiple witnesses from that first cluster of sightings gave versions of the same description without talking to one another. That detail is important because these weren't people comparing notes at the general store before writing a single account.
The reports came in separately, yet the consistency held up across the board. It was always the same coat, the same direction, the same pace, and the same eerie silence. That silence was the second thing people noted, because the man simply would not stop. He didn't turn his head when someone called out from a field or a port below the ridge, even though a few people tried. They called out greetings or asked where he was headed, which was the kind of ordinary courtesy that defined these mountain communities, where ignoring a neighbor was its own kind of statement. He gave them nothing, and just kept moving with his eyes on whatever was ahead of him, which was more ridge, more tree line, and more west. The working assumption at the time was reasonable enough for the era. Surveyors were active throughout the Virginia and Kentucky mountains in those years, mapping out timber rights and mineral claims as outside money started probing the region.
Timber scouts moved through on similar routes, and a man who needed to cover distance without stopping for a chat wasn't automatically suspicious. He might have just been on someone's payroll and running behind schedule, and that explanation settled most of the curiosity at first. What didn't quite fit, even in those first accounts, was the choice to stay on the ridgeline. Valley roads existed, and while they were rough and slow, they connected the communities in a way that a man with practical business would have used. The figure the witnesses described wasn't anywhere near those roads, choosing instead to move along the high ground, where he was exposed above the tree line. In the 1880s, the Appalachian ridges weren't a route anyone used for commerce or convenience, because the going was harder and more exposed to the weather. Surveyors worked the terrain they were mapping, but they didn't walk ridgelines for pleasure when a valley road could get them there faster. So even the first description carried something unresolved inside of it. You had a man who looked like he belonged to a practical world, yet he was moving through it in a way that didn't serve any practical purpose anyone could identify. That tension between the ordinary and the unexplained is what made the account stick, especially when you consider the coat anyone might own and a pace no one could quite explain. A single strange sighting is an easy thing to dismiss. A man in a common coat moving at an odd pace while ignoring the people who call out to him is unusual, but it isn't impossible. People have their reasons to move fast and stay quiet that have nothing to do with the supernatural, so you file it away and eventually forget it. What made forgetting harder was what started happening across the state lines. Within a span of just a few weeks, 3 separate county newspapers published accounts of the same figure. One was in Virginia, which we've already talked about, but another appeared in a Kentucky Gazette serving a community in the eastern part of the state. A third popped up in a Tennessee paper out of a small county tucked against the Cumberland Range, giving us 3 papers in 3 states with 3 sets of witnesses. None of these people had any way of knowing what the others had seen or written. The accounts themselves weren't extraordinary by the standards of rural reporting back then. They were brief and factual, the kind of item that sits between a notice about a church meeting and a complaint about the local road conditions. But the physical description repeated itself in a way that stops you cold when you read them side by side. He was tall, wore a long coat, and moved west along the high ground without stopping, speaking, or looking back. Now, identical descriptions across a region aren't automatically suspicious on their own. Duster coats were standard working man's clothing throughout Appalachia in this period, so you could walk through a dozen counties and see a dozen men dressed more or less the same way. The clothing alone doesn't prove anything, but what the clothing can't explain is the geography. Researchers who eventually compared the three accounts started with the dates and noticed something that didn't resolve neatly. The morning referenced in the Virginia account and the morning referenced in the Kentucky account appear to be the exact same date. The timing for the Tennessee account is slightly less certain, but it falls within a range that doesn't rule it out. When you lay those locations on a map and ask how far apart they are, the answer becomes the real problem. The three sighting points sit somewhere between 80 and 100 miles apart along the ridge system. That's not a short distance by any measurement, but what makes it impossible isn't just the mileage, it's the terrain. These points aren't connected by a straight road, and the Appalachian ridgeline in that stretch is broken by deep hollows and river crossings that no horse could navigate at speed before dawn. A man on a good horse with clear roads and daylight might cover 30 miles in a morning, but on that terrain in that era, the number drops considerably. None of the three papers knew about the others, and that point is worth sitting with for a moment. The alternative explanation for matching accounts is that a story spread from one paper to the next and got reprinted with minor variations, but that doesn't apply here. There's no citation or language that suggests one editor was picking up another's item. These were independent observations made by people in different states who had no connection to each other, published in papers that almost certainly never crossed each other's desks. So you're left with three separate communities and three separate mornings that may have actually been one single morning. You have three separate descriptions of the same man in a place he couldn't have reached by any route that leaves a record. That's not just a ghost story, it's a math problem where the math simply doesn't work. The trouble with most mystery stories is that they fall apart the second you look at the source material. Usually because the original account was dressed up or printed in some rag that ran mermaid sightings next to crop reports. Before you decide what to make of the mountain walker, you have to understand the kind of papers that were actually doing the reporting. Take the Virginia account, for example. The paper it appeared in was an agricultural weekly, serving a county where people spent their lives working the timber, the coal mines, or their own small farms. Its columns were filled with the price of crops, church announcements, and land transfers, which meant there was no room for serialized adventures or sensational crime. The editor wasn't trying to sell excitement to his neighbors because he was busy selling subscriptions to people who needed legal notices and weather forecasts to survive. His name was attached to every single word he printed, and in a community that small, a bad reputation would follow a man all the way to his church pew on Sunday morning. The Kentucky account comes from a different place, and honestly, it feels a bit more credible because it didn't start as a letter from a civilian. It began as a sheriff's office report, which was just a brief and dry notation about an unidentified person moving through the county on a specific morning. That administrative note was written in the flat language law enforcement uses for everything, and when the local gazette picked it up, they reprinted it almost word for word without offering any interpretation. A sheriff doesn't write these things for entertainment. He writes them because it's his job to document what comes across his desk, and a stranger on the ridge at dawn was simply a fact that needed recording. The Tennessee item is the shortest of the three, and because it's so small, it is the easiest one for a researcher to overlook. It showed up in a community notices column, right alongside reports of a neighbor's illness or a recovered stray animal. There was just one paragraph with no headline and no follow-up in the issues that came after, almost as if the writer noted the figure in passing. It reads like someone mentioning a tree that fell across the creek road, something worth saying but not worth making a scene over. The person who wrote it was just passing along information because that's what you did in those hollows, not because they expected the world to take notice. What really connects these three pieces of print isn't just the subject, it's the tone they all share. None of them try to frame this as something supernatural, and they don't use the kind of language designed to make your skin crawl
or your imagination run wild. There are no descriptions of a fearsome stranger, or suggestions that the man was anything other than a man. They simply describe what the witnesses saw in the same voice they use for everything else, and then they move on to the next story. That kind of restraint is actually more unsettling than if they had tried to embellish the facts. If an editor wanted to sell a ghost story, he would have written a ghost story, but these men just described a tall figure in a coat moving west along the ridge. They noted that nobody could identify him, and then they seemingly decided that was all there was to say on the matter. The part that's truly hard to explain is why nobody ever followed up on these reports. A figure appearing independently across 3 counties in 3 different states should have prompted a paper to send a correspondent, or at least post a query asking for his identity. That was the standard practice for any story with loose ends, yet none of the 3 papers ever did it. The Virginia Weekly went back to its crop reports, the Kentucky Gazette never mentioned the sheriff's note again, and the Tennessee column went quiet on the subject forever. Whether those editors decided there was nothing left to find, or whether someone quietly decided the story was better left alone, we will never know. The papers closed the book on the mountain walker without a word of explanation, much like the way the mountains close over a path once the foot traffic stops. Print wasn't the only way people kept records in these mountains, and for the folks living deep in the hollows where the paper arrived late or not at all, it wasn't even the main way. Appalachian oral tradition runs right alongside the written record, like a creek following a mountain road, separate but carrying things that are often more reliable for what happened close to home. Families pass these accounts down through the generations, with a level of detail that formal history usually ignores, mostly because these stories served a real purpose. They told you what the land had done before, and who had passed through it, giving you a way to know what to expect from a stranger who walked in off the ridge. When you look at the oral accounts of the mountain walker, they match the newspaper descriptions in a way that should make you stop and pay attention. The stories always mention the same coat, the same direction, and that same haunting silence. Families in the Virginia counties, the Kentucky hollows, and the Tennessee communities near the Cumberland all held on to versions of this same account through the end of the 19th century. None of these people were in regular contact with each other, so they had no reason to coordinate a lie, yet they all described a tall figure who moved fast without appearing to hurry. He never once stopped for the people who saw him, and that much lines up perfectly with what the editors printed in the papers. But the memory of the families carried details that the newspapers never touched. 2 specific details show up often enough in separate family stories that they feel like data points that won't go away. The first is that the man left no tracks in soft ground, even when witnesses went up to the ridge after a rain, expecting to find boot prints in the mud. The second detail is that the dogs wouldn't bark at him. In a place where dogs were the first and loudest alarm for a stranger or a predator, the silence of the animals as this figure passed by was the thing that stayed with people the longest. Dogs bark because that is what they do, and the fact that they stayed quiet was remembered as the most unsettling part of the whole experience. Now, you can't just take those details at face value because oral tradition has a way of growing toward the strange over time. Every retelling tends to sharpen the odd parts and sand away the ordinary ones until the story becomes something that makes the hair stand up on your neck. The idea that he left no tracks feels like the kind of thing added when a story is trying to become a legend, and the behavior of the dogs is the sort of specific detail that's easy to attach to a memory years after the fact. What you can't explain away is how consistent these stories are across communities that had absolutely no contact with one another. If this were just a legend spreading through a network of people who talked to the same neighbors, you would expect the details to merge into one single version. Instead, researchers found parallel versions that were maintained independently, agreeing on the bones of the story without agreeing on every little thing around it. That is what genuine separate memory looks like, rather than a shared tale that has been retold until it settled into a fixed shape. The oral record also pushes the timeline much further than the newspapers ever did. While the printed accounts cluster in the early 1880s,
Family stories from the region describe sightings continuing sporadically all the way through the 1890s. The figure was still there, walking the same route and refusing to stop for anyone. Even if the newspaper editors had decided the story wasn't worth chasing anymore, the people living nearest to those ridgelines clearly hadn't reached that same conclusion.
At some point, any honest account of this case has to sit down with the rational explanations and give them a fair hearing. We don't do this to dismiss the strangeness, but because the strangeness only carries weight if the ordinary answers genuinely don't hold up. There are three theories that serious researchers have put forward over the years, and while each one is worth taking seriously, every single one develops a crack when you push on it hard enough. The first and most straightforward theory is that there was no single man, but rather several different men who happened to resemble each other closely enough that independent witnesses described them the same way. The duster coat is the obvious entry point for this argument, because in rural Appalachia in the 1880s, a long canvas duster wasn't a distinctive garment at all. It was working clothing, common as mud, and was worn by surveyors, timber scouts, traveling merchants, and preachers who spent their lives outdoors in the variable mountain weather. Tall men weren't exactly rare either, so three tall men in similar coats, each moving through his own county on his own business, could theoretically produce three matching newspaper descriptions without any real connection between them. The problem with this theory is everything beyond the coat. You have three men who were all silent when called out to, all kept to the high ridge lines instead of the valley roads, and were all moving west within the same narrow window of time. When those coincidences stack up, they move past the point where random chance feels like a satisfying explanation. Any one of those shared details could be an overlap, but seeing all of them together across independent accounts makes it feel like something else entirely. The second theory is more elegant and initially more convincing to the logical mind. A surveying crew working a long territorial line would move through multiple counties over several days, meaning witnesses in each county would see a man from that crew, or perhaps the same man, on different legs of the route. Each community would then file its own report, without knowing the others had done the same, creating a consistent figure because it was genuinely the same person. The impression of simultaneous sightings would just be an artifact of imprecise dating, especially since rural papers didn't always print exact dates, and memories of that morning tend to blur together across a week or two of actual time. This is easily the strongest theory on the table, because it requires no unusual assumptions about the world. Surveying work was active and well documented in the Virginia and Kentucky mountains during this period, and the ridgeline routes that appear in the accounts would be legitimate territory for someone mapping out mineral or timber rights. Where the whole thing breaks down is the archive. Surveying work in this era generated a massive amount of paper, including contracts, field notes, plat maps, and county registration filings. If a crew moved through 3 counties over a multi-week route in the early to mid-1880s, there should be a clear record of who commissioned the work and what they were measuring. Researchers who went looking for that record found absolutely nothing that matches the geography, the timeline, or the specific route the mountain walker appears to have been on. That absence isn't total proof, as records from this period are often incomplete, but it does mean the theory rests entirely on a document that hasn't surfaced in over 100 years of looking. The third theory involves a circuit preacher or a medicine seller who preferred ridgelines to avoid the cost of toll roads, but this collapses faster than the other two. Both of those professions depended entirely on human contact to survive. A preacher who never stopped to speak, who ignored every call from the farms below him, and who passed through communities without leaving a single name behind, simply wasn't doing his job. A medicine man with nothing to sell and no one to sell it to wasn't running a business, which makes the behavior the witnesses described incompatible with either profession, regardless of the route they took. So you're left with a difficult choice. The most credible theory is the surveying crew, yet that crew left no paper trail behind them. The least credible theories fail because the behavior doesn't match the job, and the simplest explanation of multiple unrelated men
requires you to accept a coincidence that stops feeling like a coincidence the more you look at it. Every case like this has one thread that sits apart from the others, and it isn't necessarily louder or more dramatic, it's just different in kind. For the mountain walker, that thread is a letter. Sometime in the early 20th century, a handwritten letter turned up in a private collection, though whose collection it was and how it got there are details that have never been fully established. The letter claimed to have been written by a postmaster serving a small Virginia community in the late 1880s. This wasn't a letter to a newspaper or a formal report to the authorities, but a private piece of correspondence, apparently written to a family member or a friend. It's the kind of thing that usually ends up in a trunk in an attic, rather than in any archive that historians think to check. The postmaster described a strange encounter at his counter when a man came in who was tall, quiet, and wearing a long coat that matched the descriptions already circulating in the county papers. He said nothing beyond what the transaction required, paid for a single postage stamp, and then left without giving a name. He didn't say where he was sending a letter or where he'd come from, and he left no return address because there was no envelope to leave. There was just the stamp, purchased and pocketed, and then the sound of the door as the man went back into whatever day he'd walked in from. What stayed with the postmaster, and what he apparently felt was worth putting into a letter, were two physical details that felt out of place. The man's hands were wrong for the road, being described as smooth, which was far too smooth for a working man in that era. They were the kind of hands that belonged to someone who sat at a desk, rather than someone who walked ridgelines through 3 states in all kinds of weather. Then there were his boots. The postmaster looked down at the man's boots the way you unconsciously look at anyone's footwear when they come in off a muddy road, checking without meaning to what kind of ground they'd been walking through. The boots were clean, but they weren't wiped down clean or cleaned up before coming inside clean. They were clean as if the road simply hadn't touched them at all. The letter has never been authenticated by experts. There has been no handwriting analysis, no paper dating, and no chain of custody that establishes when it was written or by whom. It exists mostly as a cited source in several pieces of regional folklore research, referred to without ever being reproduced in full, which is either because access was restricted or because the researchers themselves weren't entirely sure what they had. That ambiguity is a problem if you're trying to build a solid case, and we should be direct about the fact that this letter might be genuine, or it might be something someone wrote later to put flesh on a story that needed it. But here's what gives the letter enough weight to include in this account. The specific details of the smooth hands and the clean boots don't appear in any of the 3 newspaper accounts from that time. If someone fabricated this letter after reading those papers, they invented 2 details that the papers never suggested. That's not impossible, but it requires the fabricator to have added the right kind of detail that fits the logic of the original accounts without being drawn directly from them. These are the kind of things a postmaster who actually looked at the man would remember, because they were wrong in a very specific way. The boots especially stand out. A man who had walked any distance on those ridge roads in the 1880s would have arrived at your counter with the road all over him. That was just a fact of the terrain and the era. Boots that showed nothing were boots that hadn't touched the ground in any way the ground usually leaves its mark. What that actually means is something nobody has been willing to say plainly, but the postmaster wrote it down anyway, quietly, in a letter to someone who kept it. The mountains don't bury their secrets the way people do, because when a person buries something, they usually leave a mark or a memory so it can be found again. These ridges don't bother with that, and instead, they just absorb things slowly, like rainwater working its way into the deep cracks of a stone. A path stops being used for a single season, and the undergrowth swallows it whole, or a community moves 2 hollows over and takes every story they ever knew along with them. Sometimes a courthouse burns down or a flood sweeps through the basement, and other times the county just stops keeping track of old papers because nobody thought to ask for them until the person who wrote them has been dead for 40 years. This is the specific way history gets lost in Appalachia, And it feels different from the kind of loss you see in big cities, where institutions have the money and the reason to keep things safe. Back in the late 19th century, folks living in the mountain counties of Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee didn't have the luxury of worrying about preservation. You kept what was useful to your daily life, and if something wasn't useful, you let it go. A county that lost its clerk to a fever, or its records to a coal company's relocation scheme, could lose 10 years of history in one bad winter, and that information never comes back once it's gone.
The mountain walker fits right into that pattern of disappearing, but it wasn't because anyone went out of their way to hide the truth. There isn't any evidence that the law or the government suppressed the story, and it's actually much simpler and less dramatic than a big conspiracy. The story just stopped being maintained by the people who told it, and the mountains did exactly what they always do with things that aren't looked after. You can find this same pattern all over the region if you know where to look for the gaps. There are disappearances that nobody followed up on, because the person who vanished didn't have any family to bother the sheriff about it. Land disputes ended when one family simply packed up and left, taking their side of the story with them into the next state. Entire little towns show up in the census for 20 years and then just blink out of existence. Not because of a disaster, but because the work dried up and people drifted away without anyone writing down where they went. The land itself helps the process along, because these ridges don't give up what falls between them, and over time the rivers move, and the old trails become impossible to tell apart from the rest of the woods. Most regional historians who have looked into the accounts of the mountain walker end up at the same conclusion, and they usually get there without much fuss. They'll tell you the whole thing is probably explainable, but the problem is that the explanation required someone to do a real investigation back in the 1880s. You needed people who lived close enough to the sightings to ask the right questions of their neighbors while the trail was still warm. That window of opportunity slammed shut within a single generation, so by the time anyone thought to look into it seriously, the witnesses had passed away and the papers were gone. What the communities used to hold in their living memory started to compress, turning into the kind of story people tell on a porch without really knowing where it started. Just because we don't have a resolution doesn't mean something supernatural happened, but it doesn't mean the story was fake either. It just means the mountains took this mystery in the same way they take everything else, which is to say they did it without a word or a ceremony. They don't leave you a clear path back to the truth once they've decided to keep it. We need to lay out exactly what we have and separate it from what we wish we had, because those two things tend to blur together when a story has been around this long. Here is what is verified. We have 3 different newspaper accounts from 3 separate states, and they all describe the exact same figure. He was a tall man in a long coat, moving west along the high ridge lines, and he never stopped to talk to anyone he passed. The papers that printed these stories weren't the kind of rags that looked for ghosts or monsters, and in fact, one was just a weekly farming paper, while another was a basic law enforcement report. One editor ran the sighting the same way he would have mentioned a fence being down, and none of them treated the man as anything other than a person, yet none of them ever followed up. When you look at the distance between those 3 sightings and consider the rough terrain of that era, a normal explanation just doesn't cover the ground fast enough. No name has ever been put to the man, and no record has ever turned up to explain who he was or why he was walking those ridges. That is a short list of what we know for sure. And while it isn't as long as people want it to be, it is solid ground. The list of things we can't prove is much longer, and those stories carry a different kind of weight when you hear them. The oral histories from the mountain communities stay consistent on the basics, but they've picked up a lot of extra details over the last 100 years that might not have been there at the start. You'll hear about how the man left no tracks, or how the dogs refused to bark at him. And while it's interesting that different families say the same thing, it's hard to separate real memory from a good story after 140 years. There are claims that people kept seeing him well into the 1890s, but those stories only exist in spoken word, because no newspaper from that time has ever mentioned him. Then there is the postmaster's letter, which is the only account where someone actually talks to the man. But nobody has ever been able to prove that letter is real. The details in it feel right to anyone who knows the area, but feeling right isn't the same thing as being true. If you talk to the researchers who have spent years on this, they will tell you the honest truth is that we just don't know who he was. The evidence that could have given us an answer is either rotting in a lost file somewhere, or it was never written down to begin with. There was never a single moment where someone with the power to investigate decided this was a mystery worth solving. So the papers just printed their small blurbs and moved on to the next day. The families who saw him kept their memories to themselves, and nobody ever stood in the middle to pull all those threads together while the witnesses were still alive to talk.
What keeps people coming back to this case isn't the strange geography or the matching descriptions, but rather it's the quiet way the stories are told. They aren't flashy or dramatic enough to feel like someone made them up for attention. If a person wanted to invent a legend back in 1883, they would have written a much better ending, with a big confrontation or a scary message for the town. The mountain walker doesn't have an ending at all, and instead, he just keeps walking west until he moves past the last newspaper report and the last family memory. The story isn't complete enough for us to solve it, but it isn't thin enough for us to just throw it away. That is where the mystery sits today, and it's likely where it will stay forever. Those 3 old newspapers left him standing on a ridgeline, heading toward the sunset, and nothing we've found since then tells us what he saw when the ridge finally came to an end.
The Mountain Walker case didn't get buried because the details were too strange to believe, but rather because the people reporting it lived in Appalachian mountain communities during the 1880s. To anyone sitting in a seat of institutional authority back then, those voices started at a discount because they were labeled as superstitious or prone to folklore. That single assumption did more damage to the historical record of this entire region than any courthouse fire ever could, mostly because it meant that nobody with power ever bothered to go and check the facts. When we choose to write those accounts off as simple ghost stories, we lose more than just one unsolved mystery. We lose the entire texture of how people actually moved through that world, and we miss the reality of what they faced in the deep hollows. The newspapers printed the things they saw, while the communities held on to the things they knew to be true. Nobody ever connected the dots, until the people who could confirm the details were long gone, and the mountains eventually closed over the question